Hi everyone, is that on?
Yes.
Great. Firstly, it is such an incredible honour to be here. I'm really excited about this hour we've got together. I have felt such a warm welcome since I've arrived in Adelaide yesterday, and just been so heartened and actually reassured when in a couple of months that I've really needed some reassurance and sense of hope by the level of the conversations that are happening here in South Australia, and the incredible examples and where some of the government officials are up to as well, and the questions they're asking. And so let's hope that that can be solidified and actioned, and South Australia really can become a place that the world looks to as not just a leader in sort of circular economy and renewables and wine and everything else you've got going for you, but actually a leader to really taking the decisions and asking the big questions about the role of the economy that our world needs to start asking. I want to begin, and I promise you this is the most text I will have on a slide together, but with this incredible woman, Donella Meadows, who many of you will probably know and love her work. She's one of the greatest she was one of the greatest system thinkers. And I think this phrase here where she says, all these problems that we've got facing the world, from hunger to environmental degradation and war and chronic disease and drug addiction, they exist despite humanity's incredible analytical ability. So we understand the problems, we've done the analysis and the data and the research and the technical brilliance. They still persist. And she says that's because they are system problems. These are undesirable characteristics of the system structures that produce them. And so what we need to do is essentially raise our gaze to the economic system, not just attack or try to address these sort of problems individually or on their own, crisis to crisis, essentially playing whack-a-mole. But we need to, as she says, find the courage and the wisdom to restructure our economic system. And so that's what this project, this movement of building a wellbeing economy is really about. And I want to give you a bit of a sense of the contrast between the wellbeing economy approach and often the current way of doing things. And this was an image that came across my Instagram feed, because I follow this sweet little group called Global Positive News, because we all need a bit of positive news every now and again. So I follow this little group on Instagram, and it's a sweet story of this big chap in the cap met Rory. Met this chap in the little fellow in his little jacket. And this chap was still working at Walmart. He was 82 years old, and he was still working because he couldn't afford his housing. And so Rory, the big chap, felt sorry for him and did a TikTok campaign to raise money to help him buy his own home. And it went viral, and he made this money. And it's shared here as this, isn't this beautiful, this lovely story? And I saw that and I just felt angry and sad, because to me, where were the questions about why was someone in their 80s, who should have had a decent army pension because he's a veteran, having to still work to afford something as basic as his shelter? Where were the questions being asked about the wages that Walmart paid? And so about the same time I saw that and I was getting anxious and angry about that, this lovely quote came across also my Instagram, and from Anil Dash, who's a sort of Indian tech guru. And he just so crystallizes the issue here. He says, so much of like that previous story, what that gets shared are ultimately small scale responses to systemic failures. This is us treating the symptoms. And I don't want to denigrate that, because it's a humanitarian response to an inhumane economic system. But he says we just need to find the way to tell the stories about our unjust systems. And so that's what the wellbeing economy agenda is essentially about. And it's in response to the fact that the current way of doing things, business as usual, is profoundly unsafe. Just today, the Bureau of Meteorology here has declared an El Nino event. We've seen the hottest levels of heat for July. And if you're not scared for this coming summer or the next summer or the summer in 10 years' time, please come and tell me how you retain your lack of fear, because I am terrified about what's coming. We will be seeing temperatures where people won't be able to go out and for walks during the midday, let alone work. And so imagine so much of South Australia's economy, all the people picking grapevines won't be able to work in a big chunk of the day. And you have Antonio Guterres, who's gone from saying we're facing code red for humanity, then we're in our last chance saloon, and then he says just a few weeks ago the era of global boiling has arrived in response to summer temperatures, and most recently he has said climate breakdown is here. So current way of doing things is profoundly unsafe, but it's also an unevenly shared harvest. And the cartoon, the more you look at it, you'll see more and more details, and the sadder it will get. And I think it speaks, as most beautiful cartoons do, so profoundly to the current state of affairs in Australia, where we see more and more rent stress, we see more and more people needing food assistance, people sleeping in tents because they can't afford to put a roof over their and their kids' heads. And then this picture here is the world's most expensive cocktail. It's called the Churchill, and it's made in a nightclub in Melbourne. And so this extreme level of inequality that we see here in Australia, where some people are doing incredibly well out of the current economic system, and then others are struggling just to provide the most simplest of meals for their kids. And so no wonder we are seeing rising levels of loneliness, of self-harm. We have teachers in the UK, for example, saying levels of self-harm amongst young girls are a slow-growing epidemic. We see rising levels of anti-anxiety prescriptions, people checking out, people reaching for coping mechanisms at the pillbox or at the ballot box, as we see in politics in many, many parts of the world. So that's where we are today, and this is a sort of gentle way of putting it. From the UN Human Development Report, not the most shrill of organisations. And they said just before COVID hit that yes, we should recognise the progress that humanity has been able to have in terms of human development. We have seen rising life expectancy in most parts of the world. We have seen progress in the UN Development Index. We see lower levels of infant mortality, gender and literacy rates moving in the right direction. But then they warn, and I think this is really helpful, that they say we should not just glibly and blindly keep pursuing the policies that led to that apparent success. It's not sufficient, because we are in a new era now. Those 20th century recipes are no longer fit for purpose because they're facing a profoundly new reality. We're also seeing the recipes of the past start to run out of puff. So this is just one way of illustrating it here, where you essentially see the diminishing marginal returns to growth in terms of here life expectancy that you see along the y-axis and GDP per capita along the x. And you can see at early stages of economic development, you do get some returns in terms of life expectancy here. I could put things like infant mortality, literacy rates, the genuine progress indicator, the social progress indicator. You could also put along the x-axis environmental footprint, and you'd see a very, very similar pattern. A big caveat when I talk about those returns to growth, the big caveat is when that growth is used well, when it's used to invest in our collective institutions, water sanitation, health systems, public education, when it's deliberately pro-poor, so it goes to those who need it most. So this is what shows us that the recipes of the past are starting to run out of puff. But they also come with them collateral damage that has a very, very real fiscal price tag. And this idea of failure demand comes from management literature. There was a chap called John Sheridan who said, just because you're getting more calls to your call centre, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got a successful business, because if they're all complaints, you're doing something wrong. They're demands for your services because of your failure. And just over 10 years ago in Scotland, where I used to live, there was a huge report into the future of public services in Scotland called the Christie Commission. And that report said that, on a very conservative estimate, that about 40% of what just local authorities, so just that local level of government, spent their money on was due to failure demand. So yes, ageing population, but also due to poverty and inequality. So essentially stepping in to repair and respond to our collective inability to create good lives for enough people. And once you start seeing government announcements, you will see examples of this everywhere. Whether it's a lot of accident and emergency treatment, whether it's GPs prescribing anti-anxiety drugs, whether it's the rent assistance because of malfunctioning of the housing market, whether it's some of the criminal justice system, whether it's remedial education because of the impact on poverty. Ecological economists also talk about defensive expenditure. And again, huge litany of examples that I suspect you could all point to, responding to the floods you've had in recent years, repairing buildings after a bushfire, cleaning up after an oil spill, and so on and so on and so on. So a huge price tag to the current economic system, to the extent to which, of course, Herman Daly, who passed away last year, one of the founding fathers of ecological economics, says there comes a point when economic growth is uneconomic because we're just spending so much responding to the damage. And essentially this is the best way I can describe it, and apologies if any of you are obsessed with CrossFit, because I know some people do get obsessed with CrossFit, but this essentially just sums it up, that we're having to spend money to repair what we break. That this is the inefficiency, even on its own terms, of this current economic system. It's also an economic system that tends to put the blame and the onus of responsibility on individuals. So it says, individuals have to toughen up, be more resilient, take some classes, change their mindsets to survive and cope with the impact of decisions that are outside their control. The word resilience is an interesting one. In Scots Gaelic, they use the same word for resilience that they use for long suffering. Essentially, learn to hold your breath longer while we keep you under the waterline, rather than looking at what is the foot on your neck. And again, that is unapologetically where the wellbeing economy agenda comes in. We're also seeing a lot of sort of downstream responses, which have their big fiscal price tag, celebrated as solutions. And this is an example of this. I mean, a beautiful initiative in one way in Wales, where folks who are sleeping rough, and it was probably a beautiful little local organisation, stepped in and say, right, let's get these folks some coats that are stab-proof that can be turned into sleeping bags. But what are the real needs of folks who are sleeping rough in Wales? Shelter, warmth, and safety. And so we're celebrating these downstream, or I say sticking plasters, now I'm back in Australia, I can say Band-Aids. Band-Aid solutions, and of course, spending on that sort of stuff, guess what, increases GDP, and so it gives these incentives to government to celebrate that. So there's all these profound incentives facing. And so what is a wellbeing economy about? At its most simplest, it is about an economy that deliberately, concertedly, is designed and programmed and shaped and delivered to deliver the needs for people and planet rather than the other way around. It's about the economy serving humanity first and foremost. It's about getting things right first time around rather than just constantly doing this downstream reactive repair and response. That photo I chose because there's this beautiful phrase that if you are lucky enough to drink wine by the sea, you are lucky enough, which I think is a beautiful summation, a beautiful sort of shorthand for when maybe we have enough, have sufficiency. And in terms of the needs of people and planet, there was some beautiful work done by an Australian palliative care nurse, Bronnie Weir, a couple of years ago, and all the years that she'd been working with people in their final days and hours of life, she documented what the regrets that they shared with her were. And she said people regretted that they hadn't had the courage to live the life that they wanted to live. People said that they wish they hadn't worked so hard. Every male patient, she said. People said they wish they'd had the courage to express their feelings, to stay in touch with their friends and let themselves be happier. And what you get there is a picture of what authenticity, of relationships and work-life balance. And that speaks to what we learn from what psychologists tell us about what makes us healthy, what makes us thrive. It's when we're in relationships, when we're spending time in nature, mirrored, of course, by what neuroscientists see in when they're looking at brain scans, what health practitioners will understand when we're feeling stressed, when the stress hormone cortisol is running through our veins. It's about being cooperative, it's about having good relationships, having a sense of dignity and meaning and purpose. But also, I'd say perhaps most importantly, when you stop and sit down with folks and have a conversation with them, wherever you are in the world actually, about what most matters to them, you get remarkably similar responses. And I've been lucky enough, a couple of projects I've been part of. One is in Scotland, where we reached out to some of the most marginalised groups from former shipbuilding communities on the banks of the Clyde, and had conversations with them about what most mattered to them. And then we replicated that process with colleagues in Oxfam, India, and we spoke to people in slums around Delhi, tribal communities, Muslim communities, Dalit communities, women groups. And again, very similar responses, so extraordinarily different locations. And then a friend of mine replicated the process in Namibia as well. So 3 very different spots of the world. And what people say most matters to them is incredibly similar, because it really speaks to what makes us innately human, our fundamental human needs, as Manfred Max Neef would speak about, things like having enough to live on, having sufficiency of income, security of income, knowing that you and those you care about are safe, your mental and physical health, your sense of purpose and dignity. And so these ones, I hope then, are fairly intuitive. And these were captured and distilled by folks at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, essentially about what is it we need the economy to most deliver? What sort of economic system can provide this? And it's very different from the economic system of today that treats a lot of people like just-in-time inventory, literally on demand at the click of an app when we're sort of ordering our Uber Eats or our Uber car. And it's economy that puts nature at the heart of all we do. And I want to share with you, I think, this image here, that you're probably familiar with, 1990s view of sustainable development. I think this is one of the most dangerous images in the world, because what it implies is that the economy is on an equal footing with environment and society. And what the wellbeing economy agenda is about is really taking very seriously what feminist economists have been saying for decades, what ecological economists have been saying for decades, and what First Nations communities have been living for millennia. And that is that we need to recognise that the economy is nested within society, and the two are nested within our natural world, and we need to start acting accordingly to that. We need to start saying, what sort of economy do we need to serve those higher order goals, to deliver social justice on a healthy planet? And I don't think of the wellbeing economy as a synonym or an alternative to all those incredible schools of thought that are emerging and flourishing around the world, and this is just a small subset of them. I think of the wellbeing economy agenda as a bit like a picnic blanket, that's sort of welcoming of all of those, but wanting to showcase the commonality in those core themes. And these all have their different emphasis, and they'll resonate in different communities and with different audiences, and that's entirely fine, and that's what's beautiful, this beautiful plurality of different ideas. But at their core, they're essentially saying we need the economy to meet the needs of people and planet, to serve humanity rather than the other way around, and to get things right first time around, rather than just let the economy do whatever it wants, focus on the economy, and then at 5 o'clock in the afternoon spend all that money on failure demand spending. So how do we get there? How do we transform our economic system to make it deliver what people and planet need? And I tend to think of it as a bit like a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. I mean, there are so many changes we're going to have to make collectively, and already being made. People are putting in place different pieces of this jigsaw puzzle, whether they're working on different approaches to how we share work, different business models, different design of public housing systems or transport systems, different ways of doing agriculture, different approaches to the tax system, different ways of understanding sort of multilateral institutions and geopolitics. So it's a huge suite of changes, and lots of folk are already working on them. But how do you get your head around that? So what's the first thing that you do when you're starting a jigsaw puzzle? Is you start with the corners. So I want to share with you what I call the 4 Ps, the 4 corners of that wellbeing economy jigsaw puzzle. So the first is purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. And I'll talk you through those briefly. And then I want to talk a little bit about some examples. So essentially purpose is understanding the difference between means and ends, really not treating the economy as a goal in its own right, but really understanding The economy needs to be in service of what we really want, and being very fussy about the sort of growth that we need. So not just carte blanche growth, but really saying what's the direction and the composition of that growth, who's benefiting from it, why, and what harm might it be doing. So it's not being agnostic to growth, it's not being ever faithful to growth, but being incredibly fussy about what sort of growth we need. In terms of prevention, I'll give you some examples for these in a moment. In terms of prevention, it's about really saying what are the circumstances that are driving people to feel more anxious, to struggle with paying their rent, to not feel they have enough time to spend in their families. Why is our planet burning up and our rivers are filled with plastic and our fish showing microbeads? What is it behind that? Asking why and why and why. I'm often saying to folks, channel your inner 3-year-old. Ask why and why and why till there is no more why to ask. You so often find yourself facing the economic system. The next one is pre-distribution, and this is essentially saying, yes, of course, there's a role for redistribution through taxes and transfers, but it's also about saying, rather than just letting the economy generate huge inequality in the first place and then turning to government at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, where there's a huge political battle, as Australians know all too well, about taxes, and if you've only seen the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers, you'll know the extent of tax evasion and avoidance. Redistribution is a hard ask. The Australian government, through taxes and transfers, reduces economic inequality by about 1/3, which to me feels like a fairly heavy lift for government, and it also depends on a growing economy. So pre-distribution is about saying how can we get the economy, the market outcomes, to do more of the heavy lifting, to deliver the sort of outcomes we want from the beginning. So the sort of things you'd see in this corner of the jigsaw puzzle are things like worker-owned cooperatives, the community wealth building agenda, true cost accounting, living wages, maybe even maximum wages, those sorts of things that start to shape market outcomes. And then the final one is people-powered, really making sure that people and communities are at the forefront of this conversation so they feel in control, they feel they have agency, they feel that change is being done with them and that they're leading it rather than being done to. Because there are plenty of examples around the world of when people feel change is imposed upon them, they quite understandably dig their heels in. So how do we go about getting change? This is one of the, I think, most useful depictions of the multi-level system perspective from Frank Giles, who's a techno-system scientist from the University of Manchester, last time I heard. And I think my notepads that I use, because I'm old school, have versions of this that I've drawn in almost every meeting, and I'm holding them up on a Zoom call to show to people, because this is just such a helpful conceptualization of the different layers of the system that we're dealing with here. So you've got the landscape level, the paradigm, the questions we ask about the economy, the level of technology, the environment. Underneath that, you have the policy regime. So taxes, subsidies, regulations, incentive systems, essentially that drive the rules of the game. And then underneath that, you have the micro level, the individual projects, the niches, the individual businesses. And they all influence and reinforce each other. And they all have a role to play. They all matter. And different people find their place at different levels of the system. And that's entirely fine. But let's go to the role of government here. And I want to really briefly just give you a sense of, I think, really important sort of couple of levels of what this agenda is going to take. So if you come here, this is our ultimate goal, right? Whatever phrases we want to use, whether it's flourishing or thriving or living well within planetary boundaries, but ultimately, the ultimate goal is creating a world that everyone's taken care of and has the opportunity for a high quality of life without putting undue pressure on the planet. So the wellbeing economy is not the goal. It's the penultimate goal. We need the economy to serve that ultimate goal. And then underneath that, we need government to start really acting differently, changing the goals and processes within government to really start designing the rules of the game, to reshape our economic ecosystem, to encourage the sort of activities we need more of because they're aligned with the needs of people and planet, and to power down those activities that are not aligned with what we need more of. So I want to give you a couple of examples of policy. I'm going to go to Scotland. One, they have had since 2007, essentially what Australia's just done is a Measuring What Matters statement. In Scotland, it's called the National Performance Framework, and it has at its heart, think goals such as children growing up loved, addressing inequalities of wealth and power through better distribution, diverse cultures feeling respected, respecting planetary boundaries. And they're starting to use this to judge government budgets, to judge policy proposals, people really using this, committees using this for political scrutiny. So there's sort of the big goal. And then the sorts of things that they're putting in place are things like Zero Waste Scotland, which is almost like a counterpart to Green Industries South Australia, where it's got this mission to drive the circularity of the Scottish economy. The Scottish Enterprise Agency has a deliberate effort to increase the number of worker and community-owned cooperatives in the economic system, social enterprises, B Corps as well. Sorry, one's a bit fuzzy, but they claim to be the first country in the world to have a Just Transition Commission, and they say, quite rightly, Scotland knows what happens when you have a very brutal, rapid economic transition in the 80s. I mean, they like blaming Thatcher for a lot of things, but in this case, it's fair enough when the coal industry was ripped out, and we still have huge legacy in Scotland in terms of gaps of life expectancy after that. And so they're now saying, well, if we're going to transition away from North Sea oil and other sorts of industries that are not aligned with a wellbeing economy, and Scotland has a stated objective of becoming a wellbeing economy. It's an explicit government goal. They've got a minister, a cabinet secretary for a wellbeing economy. They know they need to go on this just transition journey and help communities feel included and at the fore of this. But there are plenty of other examples around the world. So this is Sophie Howe, who's just finished her tenure as Wales's first Future Generations Commissioner, and it's her job to scrutinise all sorts of policies according to whether they align with the wellbeing of current and future generations. Apparently this tax has recently been repealed by the new government, but I think this is a cracking example that it's absolutely possible. That Sweden said, we want to encourage repair. So they reduced the VAT on repairing activities from 25% to 12.5%. You get places like France and saying they're going to ban short-haul flights. If you could get there, and of course the trains are a bit better in France, but if you can get there in less than 2.5 hours on a train, you're not going to be able to fly. Places like Italy, that for a long period of time have had a very, very concerted effort to encourage worker-owned cooperatives. There's a part of northern Italy called Emilia-Romagna where co-ops make about a third of the GDP. They have very high level of gender equality, some of the highest wages in the country, incredible levels of political activism. And there was some research done by a Scottish guy called David Odell, and he compared the co-op towns to ones nearby that didn't have such a high percentage of co-ops. And he said the co-op towns had higher levels of voting, higher levels of education, and even higher levels of blood donations. So, that nice form of altruism. And these sorts of laws that have been on the statutes for ages, they support co-ops for building ecosystems and the supportive organisations and tax breaks as well. And then you have places like Israel, but also Oregon, who are saying, okay, we're not going to tell you not to pay your CEOs a shed load of money, but if you do, we're going to come down on you with really hard taxes. And this is a good example of the pre-distribution incentives that I talked about earlier, really encouraging a greater levels of equality in terms of earnings. But also businesses have a huge role to play there in building a sort of economic ecosystem. And the good news is that there are a ton of enterprises around the world who are doing amazing work, just saying we want to be part of the solution, we want to be commercially viable, yeah. But that's not the goal in its own right, that's the means to the end. So I've got to give you some of my examples. And I've been hearing about the flourish and repair sector and the maker spaces here in Adelaide, but this is a great example in Scotland where this laptop I took in when it was running out of its battery, probably way before its time, so a bit of Steve Jobs-led planned obsolescence there. And I took it to the repair cafe and they replaced it and it's still going. This is probably about 8 years old now. I don't know how many other laptops are still going when they're 8 years old, but this is the sort of thing, rethinking how we treat our materials. This guy, you should go and visit him if you're ever in Glasgow, a guy called Mark Hazel. I think he wakes up every morning to think about how he can make his brewery more sustainable. So, those rings that you keep beer cans together, they're normally made of plastic. His are made out of prawn shells and they're biodegradable. He's starting to capture the carbon that comes out of his brew making process. He has a whole line of beer called hardtack beer that's made using bread that would have been discarded from a nearby bakery. His tap room that you can see there is all made from sort of old pallets and so on. And we talked to him about, would you want to grow your business? So would you want to just scale for its own sake? He said, well, the one good thing about if he got a little bit bigger, he said, well, I could have then my own bottling line, and that would reduce the environmental impact if we could do our bottling here on site, and it would increase local employment. So that was his reason for wanting to grow the business. It's just awesome. Worker-owned co-op in Glasgow as well. These are the wholesalers. They've been around since the 70s, so they're doing something right. And their goal is not to create money and extract it up to remote shareholders, but it's about really supporting their members, their worker owners. And this is a restaurant in Sydney, and if anyone's been there, I'd love to hear about it, because I have been trying to get along to it, and I either turn up and it's shut or it's booked out. It's called Re, and they say that everything you touch would have gone to landfill. So these beautiful, trendy looking bar tables have been made out of old Tupperware, and all the food and even all the cocktails are made out of food or booze that other restaurants would have thrown away. But it's not just smaller little entities like these lovely examples. Some of the bigger organisations are really stepping up to the plate as well. So this is a Dutch bank, Triodos Bank, who I used to bank with in the UK. They're a B corporation, and they're saying they want to channel credit to the sort of activities that are compliant with a well-being, a sustainable world. This is an Edinburgh-based company, a very well-known company across the UK. You go to a friend's house and you'll see their sort of shampoo and their bath soap and so on in people's bathrooms. They have put someone on their board whose only job it is to speak for nature, which is just an awesome corporate governance innovation. But even some of the more mainstream organisations, and let's see how they go on this. Let's keep a watchful eye on it. But even companies like Microsoft are not just pledging to go net zero, but they are saying we're going to take out the carbon that we've impacted since we've been in existence since the 70s. Big companies like Unilever saying they will not work with companies in their supply chain that do not pay relevant living wage. Let's see how they go, but these are important statements of intent that show that businesses can be part of the solution. And this is an important business model that you see in a lot of the Scandinavian countries, is this foundation companies, where you have companies where the majority of shares are owned by a charitable trust, and so they take the benefits and the financial benefits to direct to social and environmental causes. And so this is an example of Novo Nordisk, which is one of the biggest companies in Scandinavia. And its job is its mission is to rid the world of diabetes. I want to finish by looking at some places, because we're here in this beautiful, beautiful city. I want to tell you about a couple of places around the world that, again, are giving an illustration of what this feels like in practice. So I mentioned earlier community wealth building agenda, which is essentially, any of you who have studied economics will be familiar with the sort of local economic multiplier. So the community wealth building agenda is basically saying we know trickle down's not going to work. So how can we generate economic activity from the grassroots up? How can we kick off that local economic multiplier and keep money circulating locally through local procurement, local ownership, local employment? And the town of Preston in the north of England is an iconic example of that. And a recent study has shown it's been the most resilient town in economic terms through COVID and the previous financial crisis that the UK had. If you called it the global financial crisis, it was a recession in the UK. And then the subsequent austerity policies. But there's also been a study looking at mental well-being in the town, and it's increased over the last few years since its leader, a chap called Matthew Brown, has led this community wealth building agenda. And the Scottish local authority of North Ayrshire has said our economic strategy is going to be about community wealth building. The Scottish government is now bringing in a community wealth building bill. So this is the sort of thing that starts to change the economic makeup of a locality and changes the flows and the dynamic. And it changes who is winning and who's losing out of the economic system. In terms of sustainability, this town in Germany, Freiburg, is a great example because they've got big goals to be 100% renewable. They're putting solar on all their buildings. They're bringing in a ton of green business activities. They're really prioritising that. And they're encouraged citizens to do things like using fabric nappies and recycle and compost with tickets to the footy. So just starting to normalise this activity. I think it's brilliant. This is Bologna. I talked about Emilia-Romagna, so this is the town that's at the centre of that. And you can really see that when you have a high percentage of co-ops, it start to bring about incredible local benefits. But this is another example of more collective experience. This is one of the biggest co-housing estates in London called Oak Foundation. This is a shared library that they have, so not everyone needs their own library. And Sharon and I just this afternoon visited, was it Christie Walk? Yeah, beautiful town with over 25 families. They have 4 washing machines, which is a great way of using white goods much more efficiently in terms of resource efficiency. Places like New York, but of course Paris and Portugal, and very famously Porto Alegre and other places in Brazil practice participatory budgeting, where you give citizens control over local spending, where you say, what are your ideas? Then let's workshop them, kick them up into ideas, and then they vote on the spending. And huge amounts of money in New York is distributed by citizens deciding what's important to spend collectively on. And this is one of my favourite examples. That's my second last slide. So this is Lambeth Council in London. And the folks at Lambeth Council realised that the biggest asset physically that they have as a local council is their curbs. And so they said, right, we want 25% of our curb space to be dedicated to things like public seating, park space, e-vehicle charging, little urban gardens, little, I love this word, parklets, little mini parks, wildflowers, seating, more accessibility for folks. And essentially, through utilising this tiny little bit of asset they have, this curbside space, they're addressing accessibility, social connection, environment, and reducing, through encouraging e-bikes and e-cars, reducing environmental impact. It's just a brilliant example of a local authority rolling up its sleeves and saying, how can we do things better? And then finally, I want to leave you with the thought and the encouragement and the reassurance, I guess, that you all have an incredible role to play in this. Wherever you are, wherever your energy levels, wherever your passion, wherever your skill set, whatever your sphere of influence, you have something to bring. So this is something called the Tribes of the Real Economy, created by a guy called Jules Peck. There's all sorts of other iterations of this. Archetypes of the new economy, different systems scholars have mapped this in different ways. In a way, the point is that we need all hands to the tiller. We need all sorts of different folk helping play a different role, whether it's your inside government, like a policy entrepreneur, an intrapreneur changing from the inside, whether you're an academic building the evidence base and scrutinising current policy, whether you're an activist throwing soup at paintings, or whether you're working to confront senior oil executives, or whether you're a movement builder and a mobiliser, or whether you're building, like Mark Hazel with his incredible circular economy brewery in Glasgow, showing what it looks like. You all have a role to play in this. So I want to finish essentially by saying thank you for all that you are doing in your respective ways, for helping to transform our economic system to one that's more humane and more sustainable. So thank you.